Hey guys, here to finish the book. Skunk! Yelled a voice in the dark, high-pitched and loud. Skunk! Yelled another voice, and then another, until it filled with something worse, the sharp stink of a skunk's first spray. Cheers turned over as the audience rushed towards the exit. Bat panicked, eyes stinging from the odor, dropped to the ground and felt around desperately for Thor. Oh, what a mistake it had been to bring Kit. Thor! He cried into the dark. Beside him, his mom cried, Thor! And then Bat heard Dad's voice cry, Thor! Someone turned on the lights, and Bat spied a black and white two rows up, sticking out from an overturned chair. Quick as he could, Bat scuttled over his hands and knees, and he scooped the kid up in his arms, cradling him close. Bat blinked against the sudden light. He looked up, and there on the stage, arm crossed, crown listing to one side, stood Janie. Dun dun dun. Chapter 22. Oh, Bat, it was Israel in the parking lot. Is Thor okay? Bat nodded, which made the tears brimming in his eyes spill down his cheek. Thor is fine, he said. He's all right here. He patted the sling. Bat, buddy, I really didn't think it was a good idea to bring the thing to your sister's play, Dad said. Thor isn't a thing. Only the thought that frightened Kit tucked behind into his sling kept Bat from yelling the words. Okay, Bat, said Mom in her soothing voice. Let's go home. She opened the rear door of her station wagon and ushered Bat inside. Janie was already sitting in the car in the seat next to Bat, so she changed out of her hoop skirt and crown back into her regular clothes, but she still had her makeup on, and her arms were still crossed. She didn't say anything to Bat when he got into the car. She didn't say anything to Mom when she got into the front seat and started the engine, and she didn't say anything the whole ride home. Not one word about how Thor had sprayed in the middle of her solo, clearing out the auditorium. Not one word about how Bat had ruined the whole play. Nothing. Bat wished in the past that Janie would stop talking so much, but right now, though, Bat wished his sister would say something. Anything. Keeping the skunk kit was the worst idea ever, Janie said when they finally got home. Before she got out of the car, I wish Mom had never brought him home. Anything, Bat thought, except that. Bat had a terrible night's sleep. It was partially because he smelled a little bit like skunk spray. Mom had washed his clothes and given him a mixture of hydrogen peroxide, baking soda, and dish soap to scrub in with the shower. Bat had washed it from head to toe, even though Thor hadn't sprayed directly on him. Mom also called everyone she could think of who was at the show that might have gotten sprayed to tell them about the recipe. It was the only thing that works, she said over and over into the phone again. No tomato juice doesn't really work. And then again and again and again, Bat heard her say, I'm so sorry this happened. So sorry. But Bat wasn't really the stinky smell that kept Bat from sleeping. At breakfast table, it was obviously that Bat was the only one who had a poor night's sleep. Janie's eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, and Mom too. She looked tired, yawning over the steaming cup of coffee. Janie refused to eat anything at all. I have no appetite, she insisted, even when Mom offered her chocolate chip pancakes. At least I'll have a piece of fruit, Mom insisted. Half of the school was there last night, you know, Janie said to Bat. Everyone is probably going to be making jokes all day, probably the rest of the year, about my performance stinking. Your performance didn't stink, Bat said. He wanted to tell Janie that her performance was wonderful, that she was so very wonderful, because she was so great. He practically forgot he was in a theater at all. But before he could say any of this, he shoved back her chair and stood up. I might as well go to school and get it over with, she said. She took the apple from the fruit on the table and grabbed her lunch bag. See you later, Mom. She didn't say goodbye to Bat. She didn't even look at him. Janie and Bat didn't always get along. Bat knew that sometimes Janie thought he was annoying, and that she didn't always love taking care of him. Sometimes she got mad, and sometimes he got mad. But this felt different. This felt huge. Chapter 23. Bat found that he didn't have much of an appetite either, so he pushed his eggs around in the plate for a while, and Mom drove him off to school. It turned out that everyone there had heard about what happened to the play, too. From the moment Bat got out of the car, questions followed him. Bat, did you really take your skunk to the play? Bat, is it true the auditorium has to shut down for a whole week? Bat, can you really train a skunk to spray on purpose? Everyone calm down, Mr. Grayson said from the front of the class. Bat wished he could disappear. He wished he didn't have the skin for people to look at or ears for people to talk into. Mr. Grayson must have assigned something for the class to do because all around the room kids were rifling through their desks and flipping open books. "Bat," Mr. Grayson said, kneeling at Bat's desk, "what can I do to help you?" Bat shook his head. He didn't have any words. He shook his head more, and then he shook his head harder, and he kept shaking it. "Bat," said Mr. Grayson, but Bat shook his head on and on and on, like a pendulum of a clock, back and forth, left and right, left, left. And Mr. Grayson stayed right there, kneeling at Bat's desk, his hand on Bat's shoulder. Finally, Bat felt better. His throat felt normal again, and it didn't bother him so much that he had skin and ears, and Mr. Grayson squeezed his shoulder one more time and then stood up. "I think that Baby Cakes could use some cuddles. Are you the man for the job?" There was an enclosure with Baby Cakes, ears flopping, nose twitching. Bat sat cross-legged and held out one of the apple slices Mr. Grayson had given him. He had watched Mr. Grayson take the apple out of his own lunch sack, which he kept with an orange satchel next to his big desk in the front of the room, and he cut it with his pocket knife. Baby Cakes hopped over to Bat and sniffed the apple slice before accepting it. Bat, once she was happily chewing, Bat lifted her up and tucked her into the space between his cross-legged. Behind him, the class went on. They were talking about a book they were reading about a girl with magical powers that allowed her to pause and fix past mistakes in time, which at the moment sounded wonderful to Bat, even though he had read the book too and knew that everything the girl fixed one mistake, 3 more popped up in its place. Bat wondered if new mistakes would be better than the mistakes he had made. Taking Thor to the play, ruining Jamie's big night, and not knowing how to be a better friend to Israel, maybe not being his friend at all anymore. "Do you still want some company?" Bat looked up. It was Israel. "I have company," Bat said. "Pet Baby Cakes," Israel said. "I know, I meant human company." "Oh," said Bat. "Actually, yes, I would like your company." That made Israel smile. He climbed into the enclosure and sat down next to Bat. He leaned over and he scratched Baby Cake's ears between his ears the way he liked it. They sat quietly together for a while, and then Bat said all at once, "Are you still mad at me?" "A little," said Israel. "Not really." "If you're still mad at me," Bat said, "even a little, then why are you being my company?" "Because," said Israel, "you're my best friend, right?" Bat's eyes began to sting like pricked needles. Yes," he said, and then he looked down at Baby Cakes, the Angora fur and her sideways ears not up to Israel. "Best friends need to stick together," Israel said, and he reached over to pet Baby Cakes. His fingers disappeared into her soft white fur, and then he said, "Bat, I have an idea for how you can apologize to Janie." Chapter 24. Apologizing was not something that Bat was very good at. Also, it was something that he didn't have very much practice doing. Usually apologies didn't do anything, and that was the problem with them. An apology is just words. Bat especially hated it when people tried to force you to apologize for something, because no one can make someone sorry, and no one believes an apology is forced when an apology is forced. Mr. Grayson didn't believe in people making people apologize. "I can't make you sorry," he was fond of saying. "Words are cheap." Then sometimes something else he was fond of saying. "What we do is more important than what we say." And that was another Mr. Grayson special. It was, he liked to call his favorite sayings. And Bat agreed with Mr. Grayson. Doing something meant more than saying something. So if Bat was going to apologize to Janie, it was going to have to be an active apology. Luckily for Bat, he had a friend who was very good at doing things, better than Bat was. Bat admitted to himself that Bat liked being good at things. He liked to be an expert. And to be an expert, you have to learn from the experts. When Bat wanted to learn more about the care and feeding of skunks, he had gone straight to the world skunk expert, Dr. Jerry Draco. "I'm an expert at apologizing," Israel assured him, "because I'm an expert at making mistakes." This weekend was his every other weekend, so Dad picked Bat up after school. Normally they would have to pick Janie up next, but Dad told Bat that Janie would be spending the afternoon with one of her friends. The first thing Bat did was ask Dad, before he got into Dad's little car, "Can you take me over to Israel's house after breakfast tomorrow? He and I have a special project we need to work on." "A school project?" Dad asked. "No," said Bat, "a secret project." On Sunday afternoon at 5 o'clock, everything was ready. Bat and Israel had set up 2 rows of chairs in Israel's backyard. Israel's mom had lined up the walkway with clay bowls, each filled with water on top of the floating candle. The night before, Dad helped Bat find the phone numbers of Frida and Karina and Maggie, and Bat had called them all. I know I messed up your play, he told each of them, and I want to make it up to Janie. Will you come over to my friend Israel's house at 5 o'clock on Sunday night? And the mom was there, and Janie's favorite brownies, just like Bet had asked. Soon Israel's yard was full of people. The Lawrences came, wearing their blue scrubs again. Sorry, Bet, we just didn't have time to change. He said, That's all right, Bet said. You look more like yourself this way. Lawrence laughed, his wonderful laugh. He laughed was one of Bat's favorite sounds in the whole wide world. Finally, Bat heard the honk of the car from the front of the house. Janie's here, Bat announced, running up the pathway to the door. Tom walked to the door to let Dad and Janie in, and a minute later he led them to the backyard. Janie's eyebrows shot up, and her mouth was open in surprise. She stepped onto the grass. Bat saw her seeing people in the 2 rows of chairs, the glowing floating candles along the path, in the front of the garden, where Israel's mom had made pottery. A little stage had been set up and a curtain hanging in a backdrop. Mr. Grayson, sitting off to the side with his keyboard ready to play. What's all this? Janie asked Dad. Ask Bat, Dad said. Janie's arms began to fold across her chest again, like she was remembering that she was still mad, but then loosening and dropping to her sides. Bat, she said, what's all going on? I'm sorry I brought Thor to your show, and I'm sorry that he sprayed. He noticed that Janie was wearing sandals and that she had painted her toenails dark blue, and there were little stars painted on her big toes. He talked to the painted-on stars. You're a really great singer, Bat said. Will you sing your solo again? Mr. Grayson can play the music. For a second, that felt like a minute, Janie didn't say anything, and then she put her hands under Bat's chin and raised them up to his face so that she could look into his eyes. Bat didn't love looking into other people's eyes, but he knew that Janie liked to, and he remembered that Mom had told him how some people learn things about each other from their eyes. So even though it wasn't Bat's favorite thing to do, he stared into Janie's eyes, which were almost exactly like his own. Bat realized brown, so dark it was almost black and shiny. Maybe Janie saw something in his eyes that let her know that he was really sorry, or maybe it was just the candles on the stage, because she smiled and gave Bat a huge hug, which he didn't like. The press of her arms, the smell of her apple shampoo. Oh, Bat, the school's going to redo the play next weekend after the auditorium's been aired out. But this was really nice of you to set up, and anyway, the whole thing was pretty funny when you think about it. She dropped her voice to a whisper and said, Also, I didn't mean it when I said that I wish you never brought Thor home, and I'm really sorry about that. She led him out of the hug and said to the audience, Hi, everybody, thanks for coming. And everybody began to clap for Janie, her friends, Bat's friends, her family, and Mr. Grayson. And then Janie walked up to the little stage, and she nodded at Mr. Grayson to start playing. Bat sat down next to Israel, who had saved a seat for him, and then he pulled out something out of his pocket to show Israel. It was the clay skunk that Israel made for him. Hey, Israel whispered, you're carrying it. That's so cool. Bat grinned and rubbed his fingers along the clay lump, memorizing the way of the words from Israel felt against his thumb. Thor wasn't with him, but Bat felt the sweet warmth in his chest, almost as if the skunk kit was cuddled there. Janie started to sing, surprising Bat all over again with her strong, clear voice. It was beautiful. The evening was beautiful. The rows of chairs were beautiful. The people in them were beautiful. The floating candles were beautiful. The lump of clay in Bat's hand was beautiful. And right now, the whole world felt giant and open and full of beauty